Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Hey folks, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, you can unlock unlimited access to political news, commentary, opinion, and a whole lot more at inforum.news/port for only 99 cents a month for your first 3 months. Hurry, get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk, and happy Friday to you. We are going to talk about something that's, you're hearing a lot about. It's inflation, and it's a real thing. I mean, first of all, I want to express empathy because I'm feeling it too, man. I'm paying the prices. I'm in the grocery store. I'm at the gas pump. I'm watching what it's doing to my monthly budget. It sure as hell ain't fun. But there's a lot going on to it. There's anytime we see an issue like this, it enters into the political arena and it gets dumbed down so that it can match the talking points of whoever's speaking at the moment, Republican, Democrat, what have you. But it is a real phenomenon. It is a real problem. And here to talk with me about that is Professor of Economics at the University of North Dakota, Dr. David Flynn. Dr. Flynn, thanks for your time. Happy to have you on.
Happy to be here.
What do people misunderstand as you're watching this debate unfold? As you're watching, it's always fun whenever a topic suddenly everybody on Facebook is an expert, right? Like whenever there's like it's a trial of the century going on, and suddenly everybody on Facebook has the law degree. What's the public missing about this? What if there's one thing you could point at and say, this is what people are misunderstanding about this? What is it?
I think one of the things that's being missed here is simply that inflation is a more complicated and dynamic process than people realize. It's just lots of moving parts at one time, and they all get going in the wrong direction, and people start to think about inflation, and then it becomes a self-sustaining creation, and that's what the policymakers are very worried about. Although I don't see as many of them saying it as I would like, particularly those who are more in the political arena. It's that wage price spiral that has lots of policymakers really concerned right now.
I was just reading an article where in North Dakota, where historically, and you and I have talked about this in the past, North Dakota has a chronic labor shortage problem. We've always got a labor shortage problem. It's one of the reasons why I don't know if people noticed, but like when the bottom, a few years ago, the bottom fell out of the oil markets, right? Oil prices crashed. Obviously, in North Dakota, a lot of our employment is driven both directly and indirectly by oil and gas development. And so when they're not drilling, a lot of people lose their jobs. But the thing is our unemployment rate never really went high. And the reason why that is because when people lose their jobs in North Dakota, they leave, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them leave North Dakota, which allows our politicians to always pat themselves on the back about how low our unemployment rate is. It's not such a great thing because the workers leave when they don't have jobs, which means we don't have a pool of a labor force that we can hire into, when we want to grow our economy. It's a chronic problem. But now on top of that, we have labor shortages nationally. So now a lot of places are in North Dakota sort of historic boat, and that is driving wages higher. In our state, which is, that's just supply and demand, right? Yep. I saw something like the average, I think it was like $25 an hour was the average wage that was being offered for the jobs available in North Dakota. A, that's very high, right? B, that's a contributor to inflation because where are the businesses going to get that money to pay that much significantly higher wage, which I think is the thing you're talking about, is you have all of these. It becomes like a snowball where you keep adding snow on all the different sides of the ball, and it all makes it roll faster and faster.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely right. There's a lot to unpack there, but you are correct. Chronic labor shortage in the state of North Dakota for more than a decade, and really, it is the case that when we see people lose jobs in North Dakota, they do go elsewhere. They return to wherever they may have come from, particularly in the case of the oil industry. Lots of those workers were from out of state. They went back to Missouri or Oklahoma or Texas or wherever they may have come from, once the oil job was gone. But with your example of $25, you're exactly right. That's the wage price spiral, because to get that level of pay, they're going to have to charge more. And so that creates its own extra inflation. Suddenly it costs more for a hamburger. It costs more for a technician to come to your house because you're paying them more per hour. And then when people see that, people not in that industry say, well, I have to pay more for this stuff now. And so when I have to renegotiate my wage, I got to go into my boss and say, I need more. And so it cascades and cascades and spirals around. And suddenly wages create higher prices. Prices create higher wages. Higher wages create higher prices. And it keeps going on in this loop. And so what policy is trying to do right now is find a way of stopping that wage price spiral from gaining any more momentum than it might already have.
Right. Because we always have some inflation, right? I mean, there's always a low wage. The thing is you want the wheel to turn slowly, not fast.
Right. Low stable inflation is sort of the ideal in many respects, in large part because inflation does mean that nominal debts, any kind of debt you contract in nominal terms, loses purchasing power over time. Your mortgage, generally speaking, is quoted in a fixed dollar amount. So over time, as you're paying down your mortgage, the dollar value, the purchasing power of those dollars goes down, and so it's better than the alternative of deflation.
That's why if you've ever looked at your mortgage schedule, that's why the banks front load their money at the beginning of it, because it's worth more at the beginning of a 30-year loan than it is at the end.
Absolutely.
So what do we do about? Come on, President Flynn, what do we do about this? It's obviously there's no single answer, but I mean, I think a lot of people are certainly the Biden administration and Congress, and a lot of people are grappling with this. How do we slow this down? I mean, what do we need to do?
Yeah, so a couple of you're right. There's not one singular answer to any of this at this point in time, and the real question about what you do comes down to what do you view your constraints as? Okay, like as an example, are you willing to create a recession? Are we willing to go into recession to stop inflation from increasing and inflationary expectations from increasing? If you're willing to see that happen, then an entity like the Federal Reserve should be sitting there saying, yep, we're going to keep raising at half-point increments every meeting from here on out until you get the message that we're not going to let inflation take hold. And that's kind of the message you're seeing from a significant number of Federal Reserve officials, is that we're willing to see recession as an outcome in order to make sure inflation doesn't really become entrenched. That's the monetary policy side. On the fiscal policy side, I would suggest at some level that their hands are kind of tied, not even because of election type reasons or anything like that, but the fiscal changes go into effect with such a long delay. If they cut back on spending, well, those spending plans they make now aren't going into effect for 6, 8, or 12 months. And so it's really not going to have an impact right now. If they were to increase taxes to try to reduce the amount of spending that the American public was doing, those changes are not likely to go into effect for 6, 8, or 12 months. And so well after the fact. And so a little bit of a bully pulpit type of approach would be the best option they have at this point in time. And then it becomes, another question of, do you see any other factors increasing prices? I'm a fairly big free trade guy. And so do you look at the tariffs that were imposed on imports from China? what we saw with those, when President Trump imposed those, we really didn't stop buying goods from China. We being the American public, we didn't stop buying goods from China. We just paid more for them, and so that really that's a version of inflation. Not that at this point there's really a walking back on that policy, because we've got somewhat frayed relations with China in that regard.
Yeah, there's a lot more that goes into that than just straight economics too.
Exactly.
I mean, there's considerations about, are we comfortable with our goods being made by, in a country that treats their people terribly in many ways.
Correct.
So,
absolutely.
there's stuff like that that's just above dollars and cents. How much of it, and obviously, I mean, because I work in North Dakota politics, so a lot of my job is energy policy. Okay. And so one thing that really has interested me is obviously oil prices are through the roof. And a lot of that, I mean, that's contributing to inflation because oil touches every part of our economy. Everything you buy in the store is getting there on a diesel truck, or oil's touching it somewhere along the ways if it's not literally made out of oil. And a lot of that's tied up in Russia, Ukraine, right? Russia was a huge supplier. Oil's a global commodity. But normally when something like that happens, we see American producers jump to take advantage of the high prices, right? Like prices are high, we're going to drill and we're going to sell that oil at the high price. That makes sense. They're not doing it right now. And I think a lot of that's political, right? I think a lot of it's driven by how much do we invest, right? Because again, what you were talking about with like tax policy, for instance, drilling an oil well doesn't just happen on a dime, right? There's lots of investment that goes into that, to plan it, to find the right place, to actually do it, to get the oil coming out, to make sure you can get the oil to market, all of those things. They're not putting a lot of investment in right now because I think that they're afraid of that. How much of that, what I would say the political uncertainty in America right now, as exemplified maybe by the oil industry, where like they're saying, listen, we can't build pipelines right now. We don't know, from one administration to the next, how they're going to treat us. How much of that is driving? Because to me, it seems like that sort of calcifies our economy's ability to be nimble and respond to the indicators that inflation's giving us.
Yeah. Okay. So your example of oil is perfect. This is a private sector that does have a long lag time between the beginnings of any kind of sinking of well to that product going to market. And so, I would remove, we'll get to the political aspect of this in just a second, but I would remove any concern about, Republican administration, Democrat administration. That particular concern you just raised is irrespective of the political group in charge. All right. Because it just takes them time to get to the market.
Right.
So I need to know that prices are going to stay high and stay high for a long period of time in order to make sure that I get the profit I need out of this particular well. And that's what we see. Most of the industry reports I read say, look, they being the oil companies got taken to the woodshed a little bit by some investors when COVID hit and you had this incredible drop. Then the drop in demand for oil, these marginal producing wells suddenly became losses, and they had to shutter these things and lay off crew. And so there was some thought that, hey, maybe you overextended yourself a little bit, believing that prices were never going to go down. This event shows it. And so they're very reluctant to jump in with both feet right now. Now, on the other side of it, I think you are absolutely right. There is just little to no clue about, from one administration to the next, what's going to be the treatment of this particular industry, energy in general, but oil in particular, coal in particular. What's the treatment going to be? And I'll go you one further. I think it's a little bit more problematic even than just this. It's that everything's being done by executive order. All right. I mean, the pipelines are being approved via executive order. They're being disapproved via executive order,
or judicial fiat, which in some ways can be even more unpredictable.
Absolutely. And so, to me, if I'm going to point at a political economy issue that I've seen becoming more and more problematic over the last 10 to 20 years, is in fact that I feel like Congress, the elected officials, have felt very comfortable stepping back from actually engaging in that legislative process and making legislation, and they are allowing either court decisions, Supreme Court or lower court decisions to dictate what's allowed or not allowed, and allowing executive orders to sort of rule the day. And I worry about that kind of circumstance because, again, an executive order is fine in some circumstances, but if economic policy is being made via executive order, then at most you can hope that it's going to last 4 years, and then maybe another 4 years, but then it could be quickly reversed by another president. And that's the real concern and problem I see with a lot of economic policy right now, is that it's largely coming out of the White House, which in and of itself isn't a problem. If they drove it with like congressional approval or with congressional engagement, that would be one thing. But it's kind of just, hey, this is being done by executive order, and it can be unwound by executive order just like that.
Or even if the differences between from one administration to the other were closer together, but it's sure. Because there's such a gap. I mean, it's one thing if this comes in, and my philosophy is a little different, but generally we're going in the same direction. No, it's we're going in like different directions.
Yes.
That's tough. And I think like for an oil producer, like a big part of the calculus is not just, well, I'm going to sink some wells here. It's, well, how much is it going to cost me to get that oil to market? Can I build a pipeline to bring that oil to market? Because if I could build a pipeline, now I could pump oil here when it's $20 less than I could without a pipeline. Yep. But if I can't build a pipeline, and nobody's building, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but man, it's tough to build any type of a pipeline right now. So, and I think really, the reason why I wanted to bring that up, because I think it speaks to a problem. It's a perfect exemplification of a larger problem in our economy, is because our politics are so uncertain, our economy is so, the policy is so uncertain, and so our economy is so uncertain. Because economy is a very dynamic thing, right? I'm preaching to the choir here. You're saying, no kidding, Rob. Welcome to Econ 101. They're very dynamic things, and the genius of it is how often they can adapt, right? Like you insert some variable, and the economy starts building around it immediately. And I think in a lot of, like, we've really lost, like our political situation is, I see it, a big driver of inflation right now is our just dysfunctional politics, where we can't agree on anything, and it's creating so much uncertainty. Our economy can't adapt to all the normal things, wars and weather and other disruptions that are happening in the world. It can't adapt like it normally could. Am I right?
I think there's a lot to that. I think you look at where we're at right now, and you say to yourself, okay, do we have the ability to adjust to circumstances on the fly? And let's even throw out the Ukraine-Russia situation, sure, because I do think everything is adapting to that to some extent.
It is.
I mean, the prices that are changing, oil prices and other things, are changing in response to that. It's a matter of where else are we seeing this? Let's talk about that supply chain problem that we've seen going on. The extent of these supply chains, I think, were really unknown. And when you look at drastically different views on trade, or drastically different views on labor migration, or any of these kinds of circumstances, you do get businesses sitting there going, I have no idea what to do. I have no idea how to plan these things into play. And I do think we get individuals, the individual consumer, sort of sitting there with the same question, going, well, is this good going to be available, or is this good going to be available? And, and again, some of this is obviously no politician's fault. COVID was an unforeseen kind of event that interrupted a lot. But I think the bigger concern is that I don't think the political individuals have actually sat there and looked at, how do you address this particular problem of supply chain? Encourage domestic production so that supply chains aren't international, maybe in the same way, or there's backup production available domestically. Well, you know what? That might require you to subsidize. That might require you to set up, other kinds of conditions that say, yes, producing domestically will be important. We hear it as a political talking point. I want to bring jobs back here, but I don't see action being taken that really would allow a manufacturer to compete with China.
Right.
On that.
And
Even the tariff situation.
and admittedly, I mean, that's a tough thing. An American worker, right? Because thankfully, we don't live in a communist dictatorship.
Correct.
You can't force an American worker to work in the sort of conditions that some people in China are working for. Like they are violating people's human rights and are able to deliver lower cost goods because of it, goods and services because of it. How do you compete with that? We're not going to violate people's. I mean, obviously America's track record is not 100% perfect either. We're a heck of a lot better than China. And we're just not going to go there. So how do we make American manufacturing compete with people who are not are just going to violate basic human decencies in some ways? And that's, I think, where kind of the political argument for like tariffs come in, right? Like we're going to have to create an artificial barrier to level that playing field, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's the argument in favor of that. And as a free, I mean, it gives me hives as a free trade guy to say that, but that's reality, right? That's the reality that we have to live in. And I agree with that. I mean, I think shortening some of our supply lines would be a good idea, at least where they reach into maybe some of these not so great parts of the world. Like I mean, to me, if something's getting manufactured in Europe, I mean, I'm generally fine with that. Our European friends are generally good about some of those things. Or if something's getting manufactured in Canada or even Mexico, like I think a lot of that's okay. But I mean, those are tough things to unravel. I mean, those are extremely difficult and don't have easy political solutions, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
No, they don't. And I mean, it really will take, I think, more of the two parties to sit there and say, rather than every 4 years, I get a convenient talking point because your party was in the White House. And I can say, you didn't do blank. I mean, you need more proactive policy happening on the part of the political parties, but the elected officials. And that's, you're right. It's not easy. And it's going to take money, and it's going to take time. And it's not there's no instant solution in this regard. And I think that works against it, because there is if I can get this for cheaper now from here, why would I, but it'll cost more later. What are we going to do with these kinds of things? It is something that's of concern. Now, the bigger concern to me on this is that we haven't addressed this. Supply chains are still long, and we still are seeing this just-in-time manufacturing model being so pervasive, and I worry that the next epidemic is just around the corner. The next issue is just around the corner, and if you don't see the length of the supply chain and the fact that we do engage with countries that don't necessarily have the same interests as us as a potential threat. I'm not saying don't do any trade with China, but one of the things that I think we can look at and say did happen is, if you view China as potentially hostile to us, which I think most people can say, we have very different views of the world at times, then we are greatly exposed. and we want to find a way, even if it's not today, but we want to find an insurance policy against that kind of risk. I mean, think of it as insurance. Think of some of the either tariffs or subsidies to create production opportunities here as an insurance policy against supply chain disruption. And we don't see that kind of discussion. We don't see that kind of thing happening, and it concerns me, because again, whether it's hostile nations and hostility between nations, or the next big epidemic that shuts down other countries and doesn't allow them to ship stuff to us, that becomes a problem.
That was always, we ought to be very familiar with this in North Dakota, because a lot of the basis for our farm policy is rooted in food security, right? You hear them talk about it all the time, and they're not wrong.
Right.
No, I can look at a farm policy and I look at all the perverse incentives that we're creating there, and some of them are really. I worry for when the ethanol house of cards is going to collapse one day. That's a whole other show. But we're doing it. Like in agriculture, we're doing it already. We're recognizing how important it is to make food in the United States of America, right? And I mean, that's something like obviously we would have to rearrange some supply lines and things like that. But Americans could live off our own food. Yep. We could live off our own oil, if we needed to. We could do these things. We don't, because we allow, free trade, and some of those outputs are directed outwardly, and that's fine, right? It's good to feed the rest of the world too. But
Sure.
I think when it comes manufacturing, especially, there was an initiative. Peter Thiel was a part of it. I'm forgetting some of them. Whatever you think about him or his politics or whatever, one thing they were focused on is bringing chip manufacturing back to the United States, and how important that is, right? We live in a digital economy, so we need to be able to make those things here, not just because we have to worry about China putting like back doors into some of our chips so they can break into our devices. That's a not invalid concern, but also just so that if China decides they don't want us anymore, we can still get computer chips for our products that we want and we need. That's the thing. How do we shorten supply? I mean, short of, I guess, just making the decision, we're going to have to clear the path for entrepreneurs to do that here in America. I mean, is there anything else we can do?
No, I think the easiest thing is to look at it in that way, though, and say, hey, we're going to have to put money into this, and say there's financial reward, or we're sharing the risk at some level with you, and making sure that, if China decides to flood the market with chips, that you're going to be able to make the return that you judge.
We may have to hang some tariffs on those chips to say and say explicitly we have a national well-being, a national security interest in doing that. Did you ever think you, as a free trader, did you buy into the, because for years when I was a young man, I bought into the idea, and it was espoused by Reagan, Clinton, the Bushes, Obama. I mean, everybody. The idea was, well, if we trade with China, we'll make them better. Right. Mm-hmm. Like we'll expose all these ugly, some of these not so great totalitarian regimes to the American economy. And by trading with us, they'll come to understand just how much prosperity it creates. And China in particular has used it as a fuel cell for authoritarianism. It didn't work. It was a terrible mistake. I look back on it now, and you're shaking your head. Maybe you don't 100% agree.
I don't think it's a mistake in the sense that I think, you had to try it. I think it was worth a try. I think you look back on the track record and say, okay, this didn't work how we wanted it to.
That's fair. That's a better way to put it.
I think, again, and it takes time. You mentioned Reagan. Yeah, I mean, these things take, social change, societal change takes time. And to think that, 20, 30 years was probably necessary to say, is this kind of trade relationship working and creating it? I do think you can look at it in the way you said now, though, and say, okay, this didn't pan out how we wanted it to, what we thought would happen. And so I think it's absolutely appropriate to revisit it. Now, I would love it to be revisited, I think, in a larger framework, okay, in the sense of what do we do? How do we change this such that it puts pressure on China to liberalize their society, while at the same time protecting domestic industry and what have you. And so I don't want haphazardness about it. I don't want, we'll tariff you here, we'll subsidize this industry here. I prefer broad-based economic plans that say, okay, here's
I don't want to start doing it because some influential appropriations committee member has a certain manufacturer in his district, so now we're gonna tailor make I don't want protectionism, I guess is what I'm saying.
Exactly. And I think prioritization becomes important there as well, in the sense you mentioned chips. Let's look like what's really, really important, and let's start there. Let's start with the really vital. Everything's important, to somebody, and everything's important at some level. But let's start with, the areas we think are truly vital. Chips would be a great suggestion. Let's get chip manufacturing capacity back here. Or, in all honesty, if not here, how do we work with other partners?
Canada. I mean, if we're buying them from Canada, I don't think our very polite friends to the north, I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But
right, exactly. So let's start thinking more in terms of also not just us as in U.S. versus them. Let's think of, okay, how do we bring in others, and what's best overall? A multilateral strategy would be very, very.
That makes a lot. That makes a lot of sense. Last question. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. What can we do at the state level? Because most of what I write about is state lawmakers and state elected leaders. Can the state of North Dakota, can a state government do anything about this, or are these forces just so far beyond the scope of our policy that?
Any one state on its own, the answer is probably no. But groups of states starting to band together a little bit and say these are priorities, these things need to happen, I think has more economic and political heft behind it. So I wouldn't say North Dakota legislators shouldn't be looking at something like this, because they could be the trendsetters, and suddenly other states come along and say, that's the point.
We've been talking about how do we get manufacturing of certain types of things back in the United States. Well, North Dakota could probably put in place some economic policies to help make that happen in our state.
Absolutely.
So I think that probably makes a lot of sense. Well, David, you promised me 30 minutes. I got 30 minutes. I appreciate it. To talk about, again, this very convoluted, very complex issue. But really, I mean, there are some pretty straightforward things that I feel like we could do if we could accumulate the political will behind them. But of course, as I know from working in my field, that can be hard to come by. David, I thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you very much.
Want more political news like this? Visit inforum.news/port to get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Don't wait. Get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now.